Okay, so get this. You sent us like a ton of research on Roman sexuality, and going into this deep dive, let me tell you, we definitely had some pretty strong preconceived notions, right? Like I was picturing togas and emperors and all that kind of like hedonistic stuff.
Yeah, it's really easy to fall into that trap, to just view the past through like our modern lens.
For sure. But as we started going through everything, academic articles, ancient poetry, even some legal stuff, we quickly realized like, wow, our modern assumptions are way off base. It's like stepping into like a totally different world.
A world where the concept of being gay or straight didn't even exist.
Okay, I am so ready to have my mind blown.
Yeah.
So like, what's the deal with this no fixed identity thing?
Well, thinkers like Michel Foucault and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick have argued that the modern homosexual heterosexual binary, like, it just wasn't a thing in ancient Rome. Instead of fixed identities, Romans were much more focused on actions and roles, specifically, who was the dominant partner and who was the submissive one.
So it's less about like who you were attracted to and more about like where you stood in the power structure.
Exactly. And that power dynamic, it really played out in all sorts of ways, from social customs to like legal codes even.
So Roman ideas about sexuality, it sounds like, were less about like love or even attraction, at least in the way we think about it, and more about reinforcing these social hierarchies.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting when we look at how all of this played out in like their literature.
Right, all this poetry and mythology and stuff. Let's talk about Ovid. I remember reading his Metamorphoses in college. Didn't he talk about same-sex relationships?
He did, but it's super important to remember that most of what we know about Roman sexuality, it comes from the male perspective. And Ovid's work is a prime example of that. He describes male same-sex desire, like pretty openly, even references his own preference for women in like a very casual way. But when it comes to female same-sex desire, it's portrayed as, something unnatural, even taboo.
So even without the modern labels, those double standards were already like baked in.
Absolutely. And those double standards were like deeply ingrained in Roman law and social norms. Take the concept of stuprum, for example.
Stuprum. Okay, what's that all about?
Basically, it meant having sex with someone who is under the power of the penetrator. And it could be considered a crime regardless of gender.
So like kind of how we think about consent today, but tied up with these ideas about power and social standing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so power dynamics were central.
Right.
Got it. But is there anything that like illustrates just how seriously they took this whole stuprum thing?
Well, there's this pretty crazy story about a Roman general, L. Quinctius Flamininus. He was actually expelled from the Senate for killing a Gaulish prisoner just to impress a prostitute.
He killed someone to
Okay.
impress a prostitute. That's messed up.
It is a disturbing story, and it really highlights how intertwined power and sexuality were in their minds. It's like he was proving his dominance in the most, brutal way possible.
It's pretty clear that this whole power dynamic thing like had a much bigger impact on women's lives.
Oh, for sure. We see that stark double standard like everywhere. For example, Cato the Elder, he was a prominent Roman statesman. Well, he actually stated that a husband had the right to kill his wife if she committed adultery. But there's no mention of any consequences for, like, unfaithful husbands.
Wow. So the rules were totally different depending on whether you were a man or a woman.
Bro.
Are there any other stories that really drive this point home?
The story of Lucretia is a pretty tragic example. She was raped by a king's son and then threatened with being, like, staged as an adulteress, with a slave, which would have brought shame upon her whole family. It really highlights the vulnerability of women in Roman society and how their reputation, their social standing was tied to their sexual purity.
That is just awful. It's heartbreaking to see how easily a woman could be victimized and then blamed for it. Are there any sources that give us a glimpse into how Roman women felt about all this? Did they ever like challenge these double standards?
Unfortunately, most of our sources come from, the male perspective, so it's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that women had far less agency. They were often subject to the whims of men.
It's mind-blowing how different their world was from ours, especially when it comes to gender roles and expectations. But speaking of expectations, what about the men who didn't fit this like dominant, powerful ideal? Where do they fit in all this?
That's where things get even more fascinating. Roman masculinity wasn't just something you were born with, it was an achieved status, something you had to constantly reinforce.
So kind of like a performance. They had to constantly prove they were like manly enough.
Exactly. And that made them incredibly vulnerable to accusations of effeminacy, which was seen as the opposite of masculinity, a threat to that carefully constructed image.
So what were the signs of effeminacy back then?
Things like excessive grooming, a particular way of speaking or walking, wearing loose or colorful clothing, using too much perfume, curling your hair, and especially depilation.
Depilation, like removing body hair. Seriously.
Yep, it was a big
Yeah.
deal. There's this scathing attack by a Roman general named Scipio Aemilianus on a rival named P. Sulpicius Gallus, where he describes all these supposedly effeminate traits, in graphic detail. He even accuses Gallus of wearing a long-sleeved tunic to parties with his lover.
Wow, they really went all in on the insults.
Yeah.
So basically, the worst insult you could throw at a Roman guy was to say he was the receiver, not the giver.
Yeah.
Which tells you a lot about what they valued. But it's kind of amazing how obsessed they were with controlling how men acted.
It really was. And there's this whole other category of men that Roman society considered even more transgressive, senati.
Senati. Okay, what's
Oh.
that all about?
Senatus was like the ultimate insult. You could throw it at a Roman guy. It was used to describe effeminate men and often implied they wanted to be the passive partner in a sexual relationship.
So not just about sexual preference, but about defying the expected role of a man.
Exactly. It was seen as a serious transgression of gender norms. And it's fascinating, even the insults used against Senati, they reveal this focus on penetration. They often use language specifically about men wanting to be penetrated by other men viri in Latin, not just males in general.
It really highlights how central that act was to their whole idea of masculinity.
Right.
It's almost as if they were saying, a real man, he conquers. He doesn't submit.
Exactly. And this obsession with penetration, it leads to some really interesting gray areas, especially when we try to categorize Roman relationships using our modern understanding.
Oh, I bet. Give me an example.
Well, think about Emperor Hadrian and Antinous. Their relationship is clearly very intense, celebrated in art and religion. I mean, Antinous was even deified after his death. But we can't just label it as a gay relationship in the modern sense.
Right, because this whole concept of sexual orientation, it was just different back then. It was more about your role in the power dynamic than who you were attracted to.
Exactly. And there are other examples, too, like Petronius's Satyricon. It's a satirical novel from the 1st century A.D. It features a whole cast of characters and relationships that, well, they defy easy categorization.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading that in college. It's definitely not your typical Roman epic. It's one giant wild party that never ends.
It's full of social commentary and satire, and it definitely challenges traditional Roman hierarchies, including those related to sexuality. It pokes fun at the elite while showcasing the lives and loves of, a much wider range of people. It's a great example of how Roman literature could be subversive and playful, even when dealing with, serious topics.
It sounds like our whole modern understanding of sexuality, where it's all about being gay or straight, it just doesn't apply to ancient Rome.
Yeah.
Their system was way more fluid and tied to social roles, actions, not some inherent identity.
You got it. Their understanding of sexuality was complex and based on a completely different set of values and assumptions than our own.
It really is mind-blowing to think about how much our own cultural context shapes how we view things. What we see as natural. I mean, we just assume attraction is all about, inherent orientation.
Right. But in Roman society, desire was also heavily influenced by social status and power dynamics. Who you could desire and how you could act on that desire was often dictated by, your position in society.
This has been a wild ride so far. It challenges so much of what we take for granted today, even though they didn't have our modern concept of homosexuality. It sounds like they were really preoccupied with, policing masculinity.
Oh, absolutely. And the way they did that reveals some fascinating contradictions. Remember how we talked about effeminacy being seen as the opposite of masculinity?
Yeah, all the grooming and the soft clothes, the depilation, basically anything that hinted at a man enjoying being penetrated. It was all about being the dominant one, never the submissive one.
Exactly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises a really important question. If Roman society was so focused on, male dominance and power, why were they so threatened by men who didn't conform to that ideal?
That's a good question. You'd think they just, dismiss them as weak or irrelevant. Why the the intense scrutiny? Why the insults? Why were these guys seen as such a threat?
Well, one possibility is that it reveals just how fragile that whole idea of male dominance really was. The fact that they felt the need to, to constantly police masculinity and attack anyone who deviated from the norm. It suggests that it wasn't as secure and stable as they wanted it to be.
So by attacking those who didn't fit the mold, they were trying to reassure themselves of their own power,
Yeah.
overcompensating for their own insecurities.
Exactly. And it reminds us that power is often maintained not just through brute force, but through controlling language and social norms. It's about defining what's normal, what's acceptable, and then punishing, anyone who steps outside those boundaries.
Wow. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complex and nuanced Roman sexuality was. It wasn't just about who you were attracted to. It was about power and performance, and this constant pressure to conform to these very rigid social roles. It makes you think about how those same forces might be shaping our own understanding of sexuality today.
I agree. We might not, use the same terms or categories as the Romans, but those underlying themes of power and identity and social control, they're still incredibly relevant.
So what's the so what for us?
Yeah.
Living in the 21st century, what can we learn from all this? I think the biggest takeaway for me is how much our own assumptions and biases, can color how we see the past.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We tend to view history through the lens of our present, but they can lead to some pretty major misunderstandings, like projecting our modern ideas about homosexuality onto ancient Rome, for example.
Exactly. And by recognizing those differences between, then and now, we can gain a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of history and maybe even ourselves.
It's a good reminder that even something as personal as sexuality, it's shaped by the social and cultural norms of a particular time and place.
It also makes you appreciate how far, we've come in terms of understanding and accepting different forms of sexuality.
It does, but it also highlights how that fight for equality and acceptance is far from over. The Romans may have been obsessed with penetration and male dominance, but we still see those same attitudes in some parts of the world today.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought for sure. But I think it also shows why studying history is so important. By understanding where these ideas come from and how they've evolved over time, we can challenge them more effectively and work towards a more just and equitable world.
Could agree more.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. We started out thinking we'd be talking about gay relationships in ancient Rome, and we ended up exploring this whole intricate web of power and gender roles and social control.
We really went beyond the surface, uncovered all sorts of surprising facts and challenged some pretty major assumptions along the way.
Definitely a lot to think about. But before we wrap up, I have to ask, any final provocative thoughts for our listeners? Something to really make them ponder.
Well, we talked a lot about how Roman masculinity was this achieved status, something they had to constantly prove and defend, and how men who didn't conform to that ideal were seen as a threat. But here's something to chew on. If Roman society was so fixated on masculine dominance, why were they so threatened by those who didn't fit the mold? What does that tell us about the inherent fragility of power and how it's often maintained by suppressing anything that challenges the status quo?
That is such a good question. Definitely gives you a whole new perspective on things. And for those who want to dive even deeper into this topic, any recommendations for additional resources?
Absolutely. We drew on some amazing scholarly works for this deep dive, including books by Michel Foucault and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, as well as some more recent research on Roman sexuality. We'll be sure to include links to those in the show notes.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration of ancient Rome. And to our listeners, keep those research requests coming. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic you choose. Until then, stay curious.